cr101radio.com, podcasts, and more.
Welcome to Justice in His Kingdom, a podcast that examines the religious nature of justice. Featured on Christian Interest Radio and Podcasting, CR101 Radio. Your hosts are Roger Oliver and Jerry Lynn Ward. The music featured here is Holy is the Lord by Simon Korolski, who has graciously granted permission for its use on this podcast. Simon is a Christian whose passion is to sing and compose music for the Lord's glory. His work is supported by donations, and he can be found at simonkorolski.com.
Thank you for joining Justice in His Kingdom. I'm pleased to present our newest guest, John Allison. John is an attorney who has compiled extensive data on the COVID-19 vaccines. He has put all that data into a paper entitled COVID-19 Vaccines and Informed Consent. That article has been featured at Dr. Robert Malone's Substack and other places on the internet. You can go to the link in the show notes to read the article. Welcome, John. Thanks for attending our show today, our podcast. We're really pleased to have you. And first of all, I would like to tell the folks who you are.
Sure. Thank
and
you,
what
Jerry.
you do.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a retired lawyer. I practiced for a fair number of years, both in private practice and then in-house with a big company. And most of my practice involved civil litigation involving medical issues, toxicological issues, epidemiological issues, and similar scientific issues. And so I became interested in the COVID vaccines. I wanted to find out more about them when they're being offered to decide whether or not to get vaccinated. And I started doing some research, reading original articles in scientific literature, which I did quite a bit of as when I was practicing law. And the more I read, the more concerned I got. And so I ended up preparing a memo that I updated periodically as new information came to light about the COVID-19 vaccines. Currently, I'm not actively practicing. I have a consulting business. I coach lawyers and provide mentoring services for lawyers on a one-on-one basis, and also do some consulting work in terms of law practice, management, and strategy.
Did you have any scientific training in college, or did you study some science major?
In college, I got a degree in what was called physical science, and it was an interdisciplinary scientific curriculum that was not specialized in any one field, but we had a variety of scientific classes, astronomy, oceanography, geology, and that sort of thing. And so I always appreciated the scientific method, and I found that I was able to use that training in my legal practice.
So the name of you wrote a 53-page paper with all of your
Yes.
findings, is that right? And when you decided to write that, you've already talked about that you did a lot of the research to determine whether or not you were going to take the vaccine. But what was your intent in writing this paper?
The more I learned, the more concerned I became about whether or not people were getting enough information to be able to give their informed consent. And I'm a strong believer in the right of every person, each of us, to decide whether or not to accept a medical treatment, including a vaccine, based on having enough information about the risks and benefits to be able to make an informed choice.
Right. And this paper actually has been published at Dr. Malone's Substack. It also showed up on Lou Rockwell's site for a while, but it's kind of disappeared from there. But the readers can find it at Dr. Malone's Substack.
Yes, it is. Dr.
Right?
Malone was kind enough to post it on his Substack a couple of weeks ago.
And the name of it is COVID-19 and vaccines and informed consent.
Yeah,
right?
COVID-19 vaccines and informed consent, and it's the July 18, 2022 update. So it's current with respect to information as of, I would say, the middle of July of this year.
When did you start doing this research?
I started doing this research in 2021, I would say in the late spring of 2021.
And have you been able to talk to any of the scientists or doctors who have been keeping up with the problems with the vaccine as part of writing this paper?
I've kept up with their publications. I have not talked to them individually, personally. And I've seen some on webcasts, programs featuring Dr. Malone, Dr. McCullough, Dr. Yaden, Michael Yaden, who used to be a chief science officer at Pfizer, and a number of other experts who explain their findings and their concerns from the standpoint of their particular specialization and specialty.
In discussing your paper in more detail, I think the best place to start is with the idea of informed consent. And you did some research into the history of that, or you already knew about that. Why don't you explain to the audience what informed consent consists of and why it is so important?
Informed consent is a bedrock principle of the practice of medicine. And I think that most Americans expect to be able to give or not give their informed consent to a medical procedure. The need for informed consent is particularly important with respect to emergency use authorization products, or EUA products, which these vaccines are. In fact, the only COVID-19 vaccines that are currently available in the United States are the EUA vaccines. And the statute that authorizes EUA products makes it clear that a person has the right to be informed about the risks and potential benefits of, in this case, getting the vaccine, and the consequences, if any, of refusing to get the vaccine. There can be no coercion. And the basic principle underlying the development of informed consent case law, court decisions, goes back to the Nuremberg trials after the medical experimentation that took place under Nazi Germany, or in Nazi Germany. And people were convicted and sentenced, and some were executed because they're experimenting on people without their consent. They were forcing people to get treatments and undergo procedures against their will. And so there's a strong international commitment to the principle of informed consent so that people cannot be experimented on. And I think that that's recognized in the EUA statute. Another reason that's particularly important is that EUA products, unlike most medical products, give the manufacturers and people who administer, in this case, the vaccines, immunity. So if a person has gets an authorized licensed vaccine, like the polio vaccine, and has side effects or complications, they can sue for damages. And if the manufacturer cut corners in developing the drug or testing it, the vaccine, there might even be punitive damages available. With respect to EUA products, there's no recourse. So an injured person or the family of a deceased person who suffered harm as a result of the vaccines cannot sue the manufacturer, cannot sue the any government entities, cannot sue the people or the doctors or nurses or whoever administered the vaccine, and so people have suffered death and serious injury shortly after these vaccines, and they're out of luck. They've got their if they have insurance, they'll get some help with their medical bills. If they don't have adequate insurance, they're out of luck. They cannot sue and get compensated for their damages.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize to everyone that when we're talking about EUA products, we're talking about emergency use authorization, which is not full authorizations. And I became very confused when I saw that the Pfizer vaccine was approved, and I went and looked at the way that the story said is they had approved the biologics application. So I went and looked up the biologics application and saw that a vaccine called Comirnaty was approved, but there were still some steps that Pfizer was supposed to take after that point in time. Did you get that same kind of information when you were
I didn't pursue
research?
that line of research because Comirnaty is not available in the United States. It's available in other countries,
Right.
but not here. And so
Right.
in fact, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin pointed that out, that there's a confusion that the CDC and the FDA have created because the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, that are available in the United States are EUA products. And they have authorization, they're not approved. They have emergency use authorization. The forms of those companies' products, Comirnaty in the case of Pfizer, Spikevax in the case of Moderna, are fully licensed and approved, but they're not available in the United States. And so when people get a COVID-19 vaccination here in this country, they're getting an EUA product, meaning that they have no recourse if they're harmed.
Yeah, not only confusion, but I felt like the confusion was born of some duplicity, at least with regard to the media, because with all the rollout of this approval of the Pfizer vaccine, I went and saw, in doing my research, ran across the very same day they approved the biologics license, they issued another EUA
Yes.
for Pfizer vaccine. And most people wouldn't go look at that sort of thing, and they would just rely on the newspaper or online news saying that the Pfizer vaccine was now approved.
I think I agree with you, Jerry. I think it is duplicitous. I think it's kind of a bait and switch exercise that people are told, well, the Pfizer one has been approved, but that's not the one that people are getting. People are getting the EUA vaccine, not the approved one.
And another thing is, these are emergency use authorized products. And I know that the government is continuing to say, put us under emergency orders. But do you see any emergency right now that justifies them continuing to use these EUA products and to
I
mandate
don't, and
them?
I think that President Biden's comment just a few days ago, where he said that the pandemic is over, raises substantial questions in my mind as to whether or not there's still an emergency. I recognize that, a day or two later he kind of backpedaled, but that's what he said. And I think the they're more, I think that if I can, what I'd like to talk about are some of the reasons why I think that the emergency use authorization should be revoked, because these vaccines are not safe and effective, contrary to the government's representations. And I think that I can go through some data indicating the basis for that, if you'd like.
Definitely,
Okay.
we definitely need to get
Okay.
into that. So
Okay.
go ahead, you have the floor.
Okay. So I think just in terms of context, COVID-19 is a serious disease. There's no question about that. According to a Johns Hopkins study, 98.9% of all COVID patients survive. Most of those who don't are elderly with multiple comorbidities. In other words, they have one or more, and I think that typically four other underlying chronic health conditions that make them particularly susceptible to bad outcomes. For patients 19 and younger, the survival rate, according to a Stanford study, is 99.9973%. That's the survival rate. One thing that happened in connection with the EUA process is based on the way the EUA statute works, that to qualify for emergency use authorization, a medical countermeasure, it's called, in this case a vaccine, there can't be an alternative treatment. In other words, if there's a treatment that is approved that works for a particular disease, there's no basis for issuing an emergency use authorization. And I think that is the reason that there has been a concerted effort to squelch information about repurposed drugs that are approved for other things, like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, that have been shown by reputable doctors to be effective in the early treatment of COVID-19. And quite frankly, I think the evidence indicates to me anyway that many tens of thousands of people who died from COVID would probably be alive today if they had had access to those treatments. And I can get into some of the, how the vaccines work and why they're not true vaccines and the commonly accepted use of that word. But let me just talk about some statistics if I can. I'd like to go back to 1976 because sometimes we can learn from history. In 1976, there was an epidemic in the United States of the swine flu. There was a mass vaccination program commissioned by the federal government. In 1976, roughly 25% of the United States population had been vaccinated against the swine flu. There were reports of 25 deaths and 550 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a neurological condition where the body basically attacks the nervous system. That can result in paralysis. It's a serious condition. And based on that information, the federal government terminated the swine flu vaccination program. That to me sets a standard of how things should be done. We move forward to the COVID-19 vaccines. On April 30 of 2021, Pfizer submitted a report to the FDA about its experience with adverse event reports from mid-December of 2020, when it got EUA authorization for its COVID-19 vaccine, and February 28 of 2021, a little less than the first 90 days. During that time frame, and it was in this April 2021 report, Pfizer told the FDA that they had received reports following vaccination of 1,223 fatalities. Not 25, 1,223 fatalities. And the FDA and the CDC essentially did nothing. And this report recently came to light because somebody had to file a Freedom of Information Act request, and the FDA originally proposed a schedule to the court that would have required 75 years to complete the document production. And fortunately, a federal judge said, no, you're not going to get that.
Was that Judicial Watch? Was that Judicial Watch who did that, or Children's Health Defense?
I think one of those.
One
I
of
can't
those
remember. There was I can't remember who the named plaintiffs were. But the judge basically established a production schedule that assured that the documents would be produced in roughly a year or so, over a period of several months. And so that was the Pfizer report in April of 2021. The government also maintains, and this is co-managed by the FDA and the CDC, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. The acronym is VAERS, V-A-E-R-S. And it's a voluntary reporting system. And following COVID-19 vaccines, and these are all the COVID vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and then there's one, AstraZeneca, which is not available in the United States. But according to the federal government's database in the U.S., through July 1st of 2022, there were more than 29,200 deaths and more than 212,600 serious injuries, including 895 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, reported to VAERS, which is, again, a database that's managed by the FDA and the CDC. So what do those agencies do? They continued pushing vaccines. And the government has continued to encourage vaccines. There were vaccine mandates starting in 2021. And more recently, just within the past few weeks, the FDA approved and the CDC is recommending the bivalent booster. And the FDA issued an emergency use authorization for Pfizer's and for Moderna's bivalent booster. And this is a booster that has half of the genetic instructions, and I'll explain how that works in just a little bit, but half of the genetic instructions to manufacture the spike protein of the original Wuhan virus, and half of the instructions to manufacture for the body to manufacture the Omicron, a couple of the initial variants of Omicron. And this was authorized by the FDA with no clinical trials, none. The authorization was based on tests on a small number of mice. I read somewhere that the number of mice studied was 8. Now remember, these are experimental vaccines. The boosters are experimental boosters. There is no booster, a bivalent booster that has FDA approval. And this is approved without any clinical trials. Now, typically what happens for a pharmaceutical, including a vaccine, is that there are laboratory studies to assess the potential for genetic changes, birth defects, reduced fertility, and cancer. Okay, those were skipped with respect to these vaccines. Those studies were never done. There were no long-term studies to determine what the risk of long-term harm might be. We don't know. And the question about whether or not the vaccines work, I think can be answered, whether they're safe and effective, I think can be answered by a couple of data points. Kind of in the history of COVID-19, the first reported case in the United States was in January of 2020. There had been reports in other countries late 2019 of COVID-19 cases. And according to the CDC website, this was data that was on the CDC website that I accessed on July 18 of 2022. There were 385,670 COVID-19 deaths in 2020 before vaccines were available. Remember, the first emergency use authorization for any COVID-19 vaccine in the United States was on December 11, 2020, when Pfizer got its EUA for its vaccine. Vaccines started to become more widely available in early 2021. Millions of Americans during the first 6 months were vaccinated. Later in 2021, there were vaccine mandates, and more millions of people got vaccinated with one of the COVID-19 vaccines. And yet, according to the CDC, in 2021, there were 463,210 COVID-19 deaths, an increase of 20.1% over the previous year. So, after the vaccines were available, more people died of COVID-19. I can go into a little bit more detail a little bit later about why the vaccines don't seem to be working very well against Omicron. But the Society of Actuaries, this is an independent organization of actuaries that performed a study of all-cause mortality for the life insurance industry. Because, in setting premiums, the life insurance industry needs to know, what needs to follow trends on all-cause mortality, regardless of the reason. If you buy a life insurance policy and you die, then the life insurance company is going to pay. And so they need to know how much they're going to be paying out.
Mm-hmm.
The Society of Actuaries performed an all-cause mortality study comparing baseline data from 2017 to 2019, the average per year for those 3 years, before the pandemic, with death claims, life insurance death claims, from April of 2021 through, from April of 2020 through September of 2021. And actually, it's pretty cut and dried. You're either alive or you're not. And this study by the Society of Actuaries obtained data from 20 insurance companies that issue group term life insurance policies. It's typically a fringe benefit that people get through their employer. Mm-hmm. And again, going through kind of the timeline. in 2020, there was no vaccine. There was COVID, but there was no vaccine. In 2021, the vaccine became widely available. Millions and millions of Americans got vaccinated for COVID-19. There were mandates issued, and people had to get vaccinated to keep their jobs in many cases. And what the Society of Actuaries found was that there was a dramatic spike in deaths from all causes during the period July 1 through September 30 of 2021, especially among working age people. These are people who are healthy enough to be working and working at a company that provides group term life insurance coverage for them. The excess mortality during that 3-month period for people between 25 and 34 years old, excess mortality was 81% above baseline. For people ages 35 to 54, the excess mortality was more than 100% above baseline. And for ages 55 to 64, the excess mortality was more than 70% above baseline. So how can anybody with a straight face tell the American people, or tell anybody, that the vaccines are safe and effective? Because when the vaccines became available and became widely used in by the second quarter, the spring of 2021, and then the next quarter, the summer of 2021, there was a dramatic increase in deaths. So either the vaccines don't work as well as represented, or the vaccines are killing people. It's one or the other, because there's no other explanation. We're not at war. There's no plague of anything else. The only thing that changed between the baseline that the actuary studied and the period July 1 through September 30 of 2021 is mass vaccination. There are also increases in medical conditions reported in the Department of Defense's Defense Medical Epidemiology database, which is a database of medical conditions incurred by people in the armed forces who are people who are associated with the Department of Defense. And it's in the Department of Defense database. And there's a comparison of the medical conditions reported during 2021 compared to a 5-year average of the previous 5 years, 2016 through 2020. There was a increase of 2,181% in hypertension compared to the baseline, an increase of 1,048% for nervous system disorders, an increase in the range of 474% to 894% for cancer, depending on different types of cancer at different percentages, and an increase of 472% in female infertility. So how can anybody claim that these vaccines are safe? At a minimum, what should happen if the FDA and the CDC are performing their job to protect public health is to pull the plug and study why is this going on, and don't just keep doubling down, pushing vaccines, and then to the point of approving a booster that has no clinical studies behind it. It makes, to me, it makes no sense. So I think the if you'd like me to talk about how the vaccine works and what it does and what it doesn't do.
Yeah, first of all, I want to emphasize that every statistic, every number you've given is from objective evidence. It's not opinion, it's objective evidence about the deaths. And all we can deduce from those objective facts is that there is a major problem that needs to be addressed and investigated, and it's
Right. I agree
not
with that.
happening.
I agree with that completely. All
And one other,
these data
Go
come
ahead.
from
Go
scientific articles, official government reports, both this country and other countries. For example, a number of different countries, the governments keep track of medical information. Most COVID-19 deaths are occurring in people who are fully vaccinated now under Omicron. And that word's not getting out. And so it's
wow.
like I say, I think that a lot of people need to get held accountable over this, because this is just fundamentally not right to be pursuing a program that's not working and that's killing people.
Well, there's obviously duplicity going on when they changed the definition of a vaccine for these vaccines, because don't they go directly into the bloodstream as opposed to intramuscular like other vaccines? Am I right about that? Or
you're right. You're right about that, Jerry. Let me, if I can, let me explain what these vaccines do and what they don't do. The virus that causes COVID-19 is the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and I'll just call it the virus. And virus is, a living organism. And on this particular virus, there are spike proteins on the surface of the virus, little spikes. And the sure.
Let me ask you first, is that unlike other viruses, or is that typical of viruses to have spike
I don't
proteins?
know, Jerry. I think it's probably typical of coronaviruses, of which the SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus. But in any case, there are pictures in the media of this, round object with little things sticking out, kind of like a mine. You see a picture of, in the oceans, in war, where a navy would drop mines to block ships coming. A mined harbor, right?
Harbors.
This round thing with things sticking out. Okay, well, the thing sticking out of this virus is a spike protein, and what the spike protein does is it facilitates the penetration of the virus into the human cell, where then it can multiply and the virus can thrive. The vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, cause the body, they all cause the body to produce spike proteins for the purpose of triggering an immune response to the spike protein. And the theory was, that if the body then, if somebody got exposed to the virus, the body would have been trained to mount an immune response to the spike protein, which is on the surface of the virus, and that would be fine. It would stop infection and transmission and that sort of thing. Which these vaccines don't. Just to make it clear, they do not stop.
So they've endangered millions of people based on a theory instead of something that was established fact.
Right. It was just a theory. And two things, well, so how the vaccines work, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are mRNA, or messenger RNA vaccines. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a viral vector vaccine. It works a little bit differently. The mechanism is a little bit different, but it also causes the body to produce spike proteins. So with the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, the messenger RNA is encapsulated in a group of lipid nanoparticles, which are teeny little things. And the reason for that is that the messenger RNA instructions, which instruct the body to make spike proteins, is extremely unstable. And so that's why it needs to be encapsulated in these lipid nanoparticles, and why, incidentally, these vaccines also need to be stored at very low temperatures, because, again, they're very unstable. Two things came to light starting in the spring of, starting pretty early on. There's an article in my memo, the circulation research, talking about the study that was done at the Salk Institute that basically found that the spike protein is toxic. So basically, these mRNA vaccines are causing the body to produce toxic spike proteins,
Which are doing what? Causing them.
Among other things, they damage the endothelial cells, which are the cells inside blood vessels that are designed to cause blood to flow smoothly. When they're damaged, clotting occurs, little microscopic clots. And the spike protein also damages the mitochondria, which is a structure inside the cell that is necessary for the cell to have energy. So it's kind of the energy exchange mechanism inside the cell for a cell to thrive. So that was problem number one. The spike proteins themselves are toxic. Problem number two is that the encapsulation of the instructions, that the messenger RNA instructions to tell the body to make spike proteins in lipid nanoparticles, cause the injection, the ejected material, to travel all throughout the body. So the theory was that the injections in the shoulder would stay in the shoulder muscle. No, it gets into the bloodstream, and it goes all through the body. And according to a Pfizer biodistribution study on laboratory animals, the messenger RNA with the instructions to make the spike proteins accumulates in multiple organs throughout the body, including the spleen, the liver, concentrates in the ovaries, and wherever it happens to land, that's where the body is going to start making spike proteins. And the CDC originally represented that the spike proteins would be cleared from the body very quickly once the messenger RNA, all that would be cleared from the body, and the spike proteins would not linger. And that turned out to be not the case at all. The spike proteins, basically what these vaccines do is cause the body to produce enormous numbers of spike proteins, which are toxic. throughout the body for a significant period of time. One estimate, 15
Wow.
months. And so what happens is that there are a number of disease processes that happen because of this technology. I mentioned blood clots. Well, blood clots get loose, they get up in the head, they can cause a stroke. If blood clots, microscopic blood clots, if they get into the blood vessels that supply oxygen to the heart, they can cause a form of hypertension. It's called pulmonary arterial hypertension, which overtaxes and weakens the heart. Another result, particularly in younger people, more so young males than young females, but both the genders, the vaccines cause an elevated incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart muscle that cannot be reversed and has a potential of resulting in premature death. There have been recent, it's not in my memo because it just came out after my last update, but there is evidence, starting to be evidence, just reports by morticians who have described, when they go through the they go through the embalming process. They have to take the blood out and put the embalming fluid in. That there are really bizarre blood clots. In some cases, have been described as maybe a foot long. A long,
stringy blood clots,
and which they'd never seen before. And it's very concerning.
but why are they not? Why is the FDA and CDC not doing what they did back in 1976?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, it could be, follow the money. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is making billions of dollars off of this. It could be something more sinister. I don't know. I just know.
Well, I've read that this is the biggest wealth transfer from the taxpayer to private companies ever in our history, and we've had a lot of wealth transfers in our history.
Yes, this is a huge wealth transfer, and it's just incredible. Some of the other things that the spike protein does is that it damages the immune system, alters the immune system, which is probably an explanation for the increased incidence of certain cancers, and also may very well explain why most of the COVID-19 deaths, various countries throughout the world, occur in fully vaccinated people, because the vaccines contain instructions to cause the body to produce antibodies to the original Wuhan strain of SARS-CoV-2. Doesn't exist anymore because of mutations. Again, a virus is a living organism. Living organisms mutate, adapt in order to survive. The survival of the fittest. And so by the middle of 2021 of last year, the dominant strain was the Delta strain, and the virus continued to mutate. And by the end of last year, the dominant strain was the Omicron strain. It still is. Now there's subvariants of Omicron. And so the vaccines were less effective against Delta and far less effective against Omicron because they're training the body to produce, causing the body to produce an immune response to a spike protein that no longer exists. And that coupled with the fact that the vaccines, primarily the spike protein, but also the lipid nanoparticles, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute, adversely affect the immune system. And so, the more shots a person gets, the more their immune system is adversely affected. And so, fully vaccinated, double vaccinated people who are then boosted once or twice are even more likely to die from COVID than people who are not vaccinated at all. And so,
or maybe some other disease that they don't have the immune system to fight off anymore.
Let me talk about the nanoparticles. How this got past the FDA is absolutely beyond me. Both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines contain a lipid known as polyethylene glycol. I'll abbreviate it PEG. PEG has been around for a long time. It's used in cosmetics, ointments, and other things. In 1993, there was a published toxicology study about PEG and its use in cosmetics and ointments. And during the course of that study, it was discovered that PEG was in an ointment that was applied to burn patients, people who had severe burns. And many of them died, and they died from renal tubular necrosis, is basically a medical term for death of parts of the kidney, and they died of kidney failure. And based on that information, this expert report recommended against applying ointments containing PEG to damaged skin. Here, PEG is being directly injected into people's bodies as a component of the vaccines. If I can comment about two other lipids, the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine has a lipid in it that's part of the lipid nanoparticles called SM102, is the trade name, the trade term. And the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine has a lipid known by the trade name ALC0315. According to the manufacturer of those lipids, and this is information posted on the manufacturer's website, Cayman Chemical Company, and this is accessible to the FDA and the CDC as readily as this to me. Those products, it specifically says that those products are for research use only, not for human or veterinary, diagnostic, or therapeutic use.
Wow.
And those lipids SM102 and ALC 0315 are being directly injected into people's bodies as part of the vaccines for therapeutic purposes.
Do you know if the FDA and CDC knew that? Because I do know, we talked about this before we started, there is a Ketam fraud case against Pfizer down in Beaumont, Texas. But do you know if the FDA and CDC knew of the inclusion of those lipids in these
It's right
vaccines?
on the product information sheet, on the fact sheet. Yeah.
Okay, so
they knew.
Okay,
now,
so,
if they didn't look up and find out information about what those were, shame on them. They're supposed to be protecting our public health.
Well, didn't they cut some corners in so far as using advisory committees and that sort of thing with regard to, the EUAs and whether or not they should be approved under EUA?
Most recently, Jerry, with respect to the bivalent booster that recently got an EUA authorization, the advisory committee was totally bypassed. It was not even convened.
Well, will you explain to the audience what the function of the advisory committee
The
is?
advisory committee's function is to make recommendations to the FDA on whether or not to approve a medical product, pharmaceutical, vaccine, or whether or not to grant emergency use authorization. And typically, there's a proceeding before the advisory committee. There's an opportunity for public input and public comment as part of the Federal Register process for adopting rules and regulations and making decisions. And that was completely bypassed with respect to the bivalent vaccine. That again, it has half the dose, will cause the body to make antibodies to the original spike protein, which no longer exists, and the other half will cause the body to produce, theoretically, an immune response to the original Omicron subvariant, but not to the current Omicron subvariant. And we just don't know.
Yeah, but the advisory committee could bring a different insight and perhaps bring up some of these risks, or at least ask questions about it. So I don't understand why they skipped something that they do with every other medication.
I have to say it's inexplicable.
Or drug.
It's not explicable. I mean, it's not. They obviously were determined to authorize this particular booster, and whether it was for political reasons, financial reasons, that's anybody's guess. But they bypass the advisory committee, and as you point out, the reason to have the advisory committee is to have a group of scientists get together, ask questions, and hopefully raise concerns that will have an effect on the ultimate decision. And that process was completely bypassed with respect to the bivalent.
Well, another thing that I learned, because I'm working with groups of lawyers with regard to the mandates and that sort of thing, is that every other drug, outside researchers are allowed to have vials of the drug to do their own research, because supposedly that would help the original company know whether they need to modify or whether it's safe and effective. And they're not allowing. Have you heard that they're not allowing that?
And I also recently, in the last week or so, read an article that talked about a study in Germany by some German physicians and scientists that where they were able to look at get samples of vaccine, look at them under a microscope, and they found all kinds of random things in there.
Oh, so did some get the present Pfizer one? Because I've heard that they're not allowed to do that.
I think it was. I'm pretty sure it was the Pfizer.
Okay, well that's good. Maybe the information I had was
No,
incorrect
your
or
information is
incomplete.
right, because there were some people who wanted locally to have access to some samples so they could have it analyzed by independent experts, and the FDA said no.
That is inexcusable. Now, I do want to get into the mandates, but do you have any other comments on the science that you've learned before we move into that?
Just two, unless something else occurs to me. I think I mentioned that the COVID-19 vaccines are far less effective against Omicron, and there's actually a preprint paper. This is a paper that is a reporting on the results of a study, but the paper's not yet been peer reviewed, out of Denmark, that shows that after 91 days following vaccination, vaccinated people are actually more likely to get Omicron than unvaccinated people, to get COVID, from Omicron than unvaccinated people. And there's also been questions about whether or not these vaccines affect the DNA. There's a fairly recent Swedish study of a human liver cell line, and this is a study done in the laboratory. And the study found that the mRNA genetic instructions are reverse transcribed to DNA within a matter of 6 hours. So I don't think that it's honest for people to claim adamantly that these vaccines do not affect DNA, because they may very well. And I can go into more detail, but I think that's probably enough. Enough now.
Yeah, I want to make a comment about what you just said about them being more susceptible to getting Omicron, which I find quite ironic, since my work with people who are in families of people who are in hospitals. The information I'm getting with regard to those hospitals is that they're discriminating against unvaxxed people and limiting the number of days they'll give them actual treatment. So that's pretty ironic that some of the health professions are discriminating based on unvaccinated status, when the vaccine is creating more dangers and causing more of the vaccinated to have to be in the hospital than not taking the vaccine. That's just
it really is. And so just to be clear, if I can kind of summarize what the vaccines do and what they don't do. The vaccines do not prevent infection. The vaccines do not prevent transmission. And that was recognized, that became obvious as the result of an incident in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, in the summer of 2021, when a group of people got together, and several of them came down with COVID. And at that time, Delta was the dominant strain of the virus. And most of the people who were hospitalized and had bad outcomes were vaccinated. And so the traditional definition of a vaccine was that it's an intervention that gives a person immunity to a disease. And that, I think, is what most of us have always understood a vaccine to be.
So it's a medical treatment and not a vaccine. Therefore, they should not have
I agree with
immunity, in my
what
opinion.
did the CDC do? in early September of 2021, they simply changed the definition of vaccine. I
think
agree.
that should be
I agree with
challenged
you. That doesn't make it
legally.
a vaccine, and it's misleading as can be because because I think most people expect if you get a vaccine, you're not going to get sick, and that's not true. And there's also a recent study it came to my attention after I updated my memo that indicates that fully vaccinated people are actually more contagious than unvaccinated people.
So much for save other people by getting the vaccine, and you're selfish if you don't.
That's not supported by the evidence.
Well, I want you to put on your lawyer hat now, and we're going to move into the mandates. And I want Roger to put on his theological hat. But they've imposed these mandates. Some of them are, I think, starting to go away. But the military, the private employer mandates, and and there have been attempts by some state or local governments to require vaccines, to mandate vaccines, also in schools. And I just want to mention that the so-called police power of government to vaccinate in the United States first came about in that Jacobson case, and that case has been rolled out again, the Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where that court ruled that the state, not the feds, but the state had the police power to force vaccines. However, in that case, they only allowed the state to assess a fine and not to physically force a vaccine on anything, on the person. But I want to point out that the Jacobson case was a eugenics court.
Yes.
That court was a eugenics court. That was when the progressives were embracing eugenics, and that case also was the underpinning of the Buck versus Bell case, where they decided if someone was not as intellectually smart as others, that they could be forcibly sterilized. And then on to the case where the Supreme Court said that it was perfectly fine to take American citizens of Japanese descent and put them into concentration camps. So just like Dred v. Scott, the Jacobson case has a long and sorry history, and yet it's still being used by even Republican governors to justify things like, although I agreed with the idea of when Abbott shut down abortion clinics in Texas under the state of emergency, although personally I agreed that because I don't even think abortion should happen, he argued the Jacobson case before the Fifth Circuit, which I found distressing. But now we're moving into an era where it seems that a significant part of people that talk a lot on media are starting to support vaccine mandates. And I find that problematic, especially with this vaccine, where they totally dispensed with most of the safeguards of the vaccine. But what is most disturbing is that even in Jacobson, the court recognized that, and the state recognized that if a doctor said that a person was not a candidate to get the vaccine because of certain dangers, that was a legitimate exemption. And then our law has long allowed for religious exemptions to vaccines. And now we're seeing both of those dispensed with, particularly in the military, where they've been refusing every medical and every religious vaccine. Do you have any, have you done any research on that, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that
John?
Vaccine mandates are wrong, because I think that people have a fundamental right to decide what to do or not do. to their bodies. And in terms of medical treatment. And the Jacobson case, I agree with you. It's a it can be distinguished from the vaccine mandates because, as you point out, the penalty for not getting the vaccine was I think a $15 fine, which back in those days was worth a lot more than $15 is today. But it was still a relatively amount of time. People didn't lose their livelihood or get ostracized. And I think that Jacobson has been used as an excuse for some very, very terrible decisions. And frankly, I think that if this ends up in the Supreme Court, I would hope that the Supreme Court would decide it's time for Jacobson to be overruled.
I hope so. However, I think some of the new justices are a little bit big government, and so I'm a little bit concerned about that. But Roger, do you want to discuss further from a Christian perspective or a religious perspective, God's law, which of course, John, you know about that.
Well, the first thing I would, just an observation, this, why are they doing these things? It's unbelievable. It's hard to believe, but it's either incompetence or something nefarious, or a combination of the two. We go back to the basis of everything that we do is in ethics. What's right and what is wrong? I have a question. What is in legal theory? Where does informed consent come from? So I don't think it's necessarily universal in the whole world. You can go to other nations, and I don't think the doctrine exists in their law. What is the legal precedent, or what is our legal doctrine behind it? Where do we get the idea that of informed consent? That's a question I have. I know they don't teach theory much anymore, but maybe you've got some observations about that.
Jerry, do you have any comment?
That's you, John.
Yeah, I'm asking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
John.
I think it's been recognized by courts, and this is before we started the program. I mentioned this is one of the things I want to be, doing some legal research on. But it's been recognized by courts for quite a while that people have the right to give or not give their informed consent. And I know that when I was practicing law in the state of Washington, there was a statute that governed medical malpractice cases. And one of the statutory bases for a malpractice claim would be a physician's or healthcare provider's failure to obtain the patient's informed consent. That's a matter of statute.
So, okay, that's a statute, and then we have precedent. But where does the theory come from in the first place? I would suspect that it's a leftover of the shadow of the Christian foundation of our nation. Thou shalt not kill, and the positive side is that yes, you will preserve life. I was thinking about the Hippocratic oath. First, don't cause no harm. I think we got too much Greek in the ethics of our medical system and not enough Bible. The problem with the Greek system is that there was unlimited liability. If you contracted to heal somebody and failed, it could cost you your life. So it's a pagan system. What we got to do, I think, is go back to what is the ethic that God demands of us? Thou shalt not kill. And also, we've got a whole lot of what I'm hearing is a violation of the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. We have been misled from the beginning, and the voices that are contrary to this are shut down or canceled. There's something going on here that's more than medical And it's more than transfer of wealth. I think there's an ideological thing going on that we know people that he who hates God loves death. And they have plans to reduce population, all those sorts of things. You can call it a conspiracy theory, but they've said it. They've said it out loud. So, what I understand in our law schools, we don't study legal theory anymore. It's just all precedents.
Yeah,
And
I think that came about in the late 1800s.
Well, there is a concept in the law of going back to fundamental principles. And Roger, I agree with you. I mean, I think that
there we go.
Hippocratic oath, do no harm. I think the commandment, thou shalt not kill. I think that's pertinent. I think the commandment, and I'm paraphrasing, the commandment, thou shalt not steal, is pertinent because basically stealing a person's choice. And there has to be a compelling reason for doing that. There has to be due process for doing that. And it's gotten so bad here in California, where I live, and I don't practice law anymore. I've never practiced in California. But there's a bill that is sitting on our governor's desk, and people are terrified he's not going to veto it. That basically says that any physician who gives patient advice contrary to the accepted narrative with respect to COVID-19 or the vaccines can be disciplined and can lose their license. And so how can a person
I saw that.
possibly give their informed consent if their doctor is Muslim?
Well, for years, one thing that the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, which is kind of the conservative answer to the AMA, they've been warning about the electronic health records and the electronic medical records because that allows tracking of physicians, and therefore physicians it's another way to discourage independent medical judgment among physicians and to force them to follow the narrative set out by the NIH, the CDC, the FDA, hospital administrators, bean counters, in other words. So, this is a situation where physicians need to be rising up and saying, set my people free. And we need to help them, or else we might as well forget having adequate medical care instead of medical care that is something out of That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. You've read that, Roger. Have you ever read C.S. Lewis' That Hideous Strength?
I haven't, Jerry, but
I've read parts of it.
And I think if we just look back in history and think about how people were punished historically for going against the accepted narrative. Okay. There was Copernicus, who was punished for daring to suggest that the earth was not flat. There was Galileo, who was, I think, confined to his house. He was punished for claiming that the earth revolves around the sun instead of the other way around. And in the medical profession, it's not terribly long ago that doctors were treating disease by applying leeches to their patient's body under the theory that the leeches would suck out the toxin. We've moved beyond that. And I think that censorship of scientific and medical information will destroy progress. I mean, we'll never.
Well, I think it's more than that. It just destroys freedom. It's a case of destroying our ability to think for ourselves. Science has become a religion. It's a God that replaced the God of the Bible. So it's really not what most people think of science, the guy with a white lab coat that says, believe me, trust me, that's alchemy. That's not science. If there is no interaction, or if there is no disagreement, I think it was Patton used to say to his staff, if everybody's thinking alike, nobody's thinking. Well, if everybody's saying the same thing, it's a settled science is not science. It's something else. It's a lie. And the other issue biblically is restitution and liability. Any vaccine, any medical procedure, not just this vaccine, but no manufacturer should be exempt from being sued for what happens to a patient from using their drugs. All vaccines should be included in that. So we got a whole bunch of things going on here that are we have completely turned our backs on and are going down our own way. We shall be like the Most High is what we're saying, what our leaders are saying, what our elite is saying. That's what we've come, and we shut down the whole economy based on fraudulent science. And so all of these things are fundamental violations of God's law. The question is, what can we do about it? How can we, other than raising our voices and saying, I don't want to do it? I did the same research and decided I'm not getting the shot. And we have family members who got all the shots, and we wonder about the effects of that.
Yeah.
We lost my wife's youngest, her sister was only 61, died of cancer 2 years after getting all the shots and the boosters. Who knows? But it just doesn't make sense. So anyway, that's the things that came to my mind in terms of biblical law, and it shows the weakness of our system, right? You set a new precedent, and the old precedent of protecting yourself goes out the window because we don't have a source anymore outside of ourselves for what is right and wrong. It's whoever has the power makes the rules.
Yeah, we have a horror show, and John, you were talking about there needs to be consequences, and there are groups of lawyers trying to think of a way to hold everyone related to these vaccines and the mandates, and also what's happening in the ICUs of hospitals accountable. What kind of forum? Because we're in Texas. Not only is there the Federal PrEP Act that you talked about earlier with respect to the immunities, but the Texas legislature had a special session back in the summer of 2021, and in June, a similar type statute was put on the books in Texas to protect everyone who has anything to do with COVID from anything that's not intentional or grossly negligent is essentially what the standard is. And it's a standard set so high that nobody would ever be able to have the information to prove to overcome that immunity. And it's just really hard to think of how can we hold them accountable.
Well,
Do you have any thoughts?
let me just ask a question, Jerry. I think let's say there's a case where a hospital administers remdesivir to a patient contrary to the patient's wishes.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that be a crime?
I would think it would be a crime, especially if they die or have to be on dialysis for the rest of their life or something. But and there are actually 2 civil lawsuits in California right now by brave lawyers against the use of remdesivir and the lack of informed consent, because in the hospitals, not only are they not telling them what the potential outcome of remdesivir is, sometimes they're giving it to them over their objections, and that's battery.
That's battery, and
that's a crime. But you have to have DAs that will do something about it, or you have to have, in Texas, individual citizens have the right to bring complaints directly to grand juries, and citizens, Yeah, but the DAs interfere. I know a guy who back in 2008 went to submit a complaint to the grand jury in Travis County, and the DA said, "No, you're not going to do that." So he went to the judge, and it was a judge that thought outside the box, I would say, and he submitted it. He made the DA let him submit it, but then the DA went in and conducted the grand jury and sabotaged the whole thing. So a lot of our institutions aren't working like they were meant to. I mean, the grand jury is the people. It is another check and balance on civil government.
Well, a lot of our institutions are not working.
Well, we might have to have. Remember, Martin Luther King's family did not believe that the person who was convicted was the one who killed Martin Luther King, or at least that some other people were involved. And they had a trial. They did a citizen's trial that was set up just like a regular trial and got a lot of publicity. I mean, that could be something we could do. Of course, that would be extremely expensive, and you'd have to make sure that you had enough exposure for it to have any impact. And I'm not sure Martin Luther King's, the trial in the Martin Luther King case had that much impact, because some people don't even know it, or most people don't even know it happened.
Actually, I don't. I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so I don't know what to do, but there are a lot of smart lawyers out there brainstorming, and there are brave lawyers who are challenging the remdesivir. They're probably going to come up against some claim of immunity for that. Maybe not in California. In Texas, we have draconian tort reform. Maybe not in California. I don't know. But so, Roger, do you have any other insights into?
Well, this thing is affecting. One of the things, of course, of interest to me is that it's affecting military readiness. Nobody wants to. Some of our best soldiers are being thrown out of the Army, and nobody wants to join besides being woke, being forced to be an experiment. I remember having to get the shots, but it's nobody wants to join right now. Nobody's, and the services are not meeting their recruitment goals. You have to ask: is there something planned going on behind this? The institutions are only as good as the people. They're only as good as us, and our willingness to go back to the ethics that God has demanded of us in our personal lives, to start right there. But yeah, we've got to do something about it, whatever that is, whatever we're able to do, because we're about to crash. California, I don't envy you anymore. I was born and raised there, but I don't envy you for living in California nowadays with the government you got out there. But
yeah, I have an uncle who lives in La Jolla, and I don't know why he stays.
Well, Roger, I agree with your comment. I mean, I think that we need to get back in touch with the fact that we're all created by God, and that God is the source of everything. And I think part of what's happening is that the state is playing God, and that cannot have a happy ending. It cannot have a happy ending.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's not new in history either. I had a thought about the VAERS system too, which I think is pretty fraudulent in itself. And the courts that you go to, what I've read about them is that they're hostile towards the victim.
Are you talking about the vaccine courts? Are you talking about the vaccine?
Yeah, the vaccine courts are hostile towards the victim. They're bought and paid for by the pharmacy industry, and there's some very nefarious stuff going on there. Somebody gave me a title of a book recently about murder by vaccine. It's about how our medical system has been subverted since the late 1800s.
Oh, murder by injection by Eustace Mullins.
That's it.
And
how did we get here, and what can we do to turn it around? We need to start by getting on our knees and praying Daniel's prayer for the nation in chapter 9 of Daniel.
Yeah, because I think we've allowed our civil government to act like God in many other areas, and the church has been silent about it. The people have been silent about it, and this is the consequences of staying silent and letting the government usurp the authority that God gave us and the authority of God.
Mm-hmm. I would guess that, I mean, I'm just guessing about half the population is all in for it. They actually think of the government as God, and a whole lot of Christians and a whole lot of seminaries and a whole lot of pulpits are right in there with them.
Well, look how they closed down
we
the
got to-
churches.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
agreed, except for some brave pastors, closed down the churches. Do you know if they closed down the synagogues, John?
I think it closed down everything for quite a while.
Oh, in California, they made, well, California's where they arrested some pastors, isn't it? Yeah. John MacArthur? Yeah, John
That would
MacArthur.
not,
So,
I don't know if they never arrested him, but they threatened him.
oh, I
They
thought,
threatened to shut down.
oh,
I don't think so. But may have. They may have.
I may be confusing that with what happened in
well,
Canada.
I think what we can do, what we need to do is to speak up and do what we can.
Mm-hmm.
And this program is one of the ways we're speaking up. So, John, do you have any final comments? Because we're going on an hour and a half, and I'm sure you've got other things you need to do.
Let me just think for a moment. I don't think so. I mean, I think this is a incredible state of affairs that we're dealing with. The agencies that are supposed to be protecting our public health have failed. And I just hope that through the word getting out, and frankly through litigation, and also some prosecutions, that this can get turned around, because this is inexcusable and it must never happen again.
And I think what would help perhaps move that along would be prayer and repentance.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, John, I really enjoyed this, and thank you so much for being on the program. I learned a lot. It really reinforced what I read in your paper, because your paper is quite long. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I was relieved to find out that that a good portion of it was
References, right?
What do you call it? Bibliography.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
It's well sourced, that's for sure.
I had read most of those, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm impressed, Roger.
You're welcome. Well, thank you.
Thank you,
Jerry, thank
everyone.
you.
I'm
So much.